Hey you, welcome to Simply Worldbuilding. This episode, we're going to be tackling maps. The maps. So we're doing a bit of a demonstration of what is called the rice method or bean method. We used rice though. As you can see, we kind of have it done already, but we do have a video of us doing the process so that you can actually see that coming up right now.
Welcome back. So, as you can see, basically the gist of it is take a handful of rice or beans or whatever, and then just sort of scatter it around. And if you've got already an idea in your head of how you'd vaguely like it to be shaped, you can do all kinds of crazy shape maps. Like we've got this one that has a lot of different angles and stuff like that. And then you have some where if you just kind of pour in the center, it'll end up a little bit more circular like that. But if you've got kind of an idea how you'd like some of the content to be shaped, then you can always do that. And the rice just adds a bit of an element of randomness, which for things like coastline is very good because without that, it's very easy to make a sort of weird looking coastline that doesn't seem quite natural. And dropping things like rice or beans on there gives it that element of randomness, jaggedness, and stuff like that.
Yeah, when adding the randomness does make it nice, because it is easy once you just kind of keep going and keep going to find yourself actually hitting repeating patterns that you don't really notice are subconsciously coming out.
Exactly. Yeah.
So adding a level of randomness is good. However, don't be afraid to make adjustments, because this method is mostly just to add a level of naturalness to it. If you want something to feel unnatural or you just don't like the way it poured, feel free to do it again. It's absolutely okay to not do your first take. There was
at a few points there we pushed some rice around to make things feel like if you can tell already something is not quite how you want it, just adjust it on the fly. It's just an aid to help you sort something out that feels a little bit more natural and right. And then, as you could probably see in the video as well, there's a bunch of times where we didn't follow the exact pattern that the rice was going in because we kind of saw something in our heads that felt a little bit more like interesting, I guess, to us, or unique. But we have our maps done up here, and I think today we'll probably focus on things like geography or important landmarks. And I think that in the last episode there we mentioned having already planned things that you want in there. And now that you have these kind of maps, you can basically just take, like, let's say you've got, I think last time we had like that one little bay. So you could see over here, something like that. That's looking a little bit boring. Let's put that bay there. And so you can just copy paste basically anything or adjust things now that you have it. It's just a good start.
Yeah, and the thing about your map, and this is something I was kind of thinking as well, is that don't feel compelled to make your map complete, because the map is very oftentimes never complete. Especially if you have an instance of players playing something, you want sometimes to put something else in there that you hadn't considered before. And so yeah, your map is probably never ever going to be complete, but you're going to put as much in it as you feel is necessary for the moment.
Yeah, you got to give yourself some things to sort of build off of, but your map is going to continue to evolve until the last possible minute. But that's why you start with the outline, then adjust the outline, and then put in landmarks and monuments and geography and stuff like that. And then that'll change as time goes on as well. But it's going to give you something to focus on and mark things down on as you go about actually building the things in your world. Places to put them as a little bookmark, and then you can come back to that later, or adjust it when you put in something else that's going to impact that, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, another thing about the map and the map making process is we don't have a lot of concrete stuff kind of quote unquote down in our world, but one thing is I feel like it's okay to start the map relatively early, because oftentimes, I'm taking your pencil again, oftentimes the map will actually kind of bounce back at you and give you some level of inspiration as well. Sort of an easy example of something I kind of thought of while we were in the process of doing this is over in this sort of area here, just because of the sort of nature of the coastline. I thought it would be really cool to make this area kind of sort of a swampy land, just because it kind of popped in my brain just from like looking at the squiggly lines and seeing little areas of interest that might sort of pop out might actually inspire an idea in you. And so having a bit of the map there for you to play with as you get into the process of world building is actually going to be probably helpful. But again, if you get so fixated on the map that you try and complete it, you really do cut off the ability for you to sort of have this bounce back in between you and your actual map of your world.
So I think that throughout this episode, there's probably going to be a lot of different, especially when it comes to geography. There are a million things to think about, like rules of geography, science, and stuff like that. But Secret Time, it doesn't have to be that deep. So even though typically in real life mountains follow fault lines of your tectonic plates, you don't need to worry about that too much. If you're building something that is incredibly deep and you want the history that goes back hundreds of thousands or millions of years, okay, you can do plate tectonics. But if you're just trying to set up something that looks nice for your book or for your game, you don't need to worry about the Coriolis effect and your plate tectonics and continental drift really that much. That being said, we actually did consider continental drift in this one because it just kind of looks cool, to be honest. But you don't need to worry about that all that much. It's just the basic things that kind of feel a little jarring, like a river that moves uphill or something. Or you mentioned like rivers splitting and converging and stuff like that. Or doesn't necessarily follow scientific rules, but if you want to have one thing that is an outlier, that can be a cool thing.
Absolutely.
Like a river moving upstream, that's interesting, and so you can choose to break these rules, but don't worry too hard about the scientific rules, because for us at least, this is a fantasy thing, and so it doesn't have to be that deep.
Yeah, and oftentimes a player or reader or anyone looking into your world, when it comes down to whether the geography makes sense, if you put it a little deeper than a puddle's worth of thought, that's often good enough. So don't get fixated on it, worrying that, oh well, if they walk out of a jungle into a desert, is someone gonna bring it up? Reality is often stranger than fiction, and so in cases like that, it's probably gonna be okay. Then again, sometimes it's fun to consider those things like plate tectonics and how whatever your world's version of Pangea separated. That can be fun. Dive into it if it's fun for you. Don't get fixated on it. You'll be okay.
You can spend like infinite hours worrying about the tiny little moving pieces that is geography and nature. And
is this a cold current or a warm ocean current? You're going to be passing down your world building to the next generation if you focus on it like that. So just don't
have a little fun.
Don't
bend some of the rules.
I would like to point out that, especially with you talking about the transition of desert into jungle, that literally happens in Stephen King's The Dark Tower, Book 1. He goes directly from a desert into a jungle with absolutely no transition.
Did it make you scream and cry?
No, I was loving the book.
Then we'll be all right. Exactly.
So we have sort of these two primary continents. What we're probably going to do, just so you understand getting into it, is we're going to have fun doing this on paper. But what we're going to probably do in the future, as we need to get more microscopic detailed or have the ability to make changes to stuff we've laid down the groundwork for already, we're starting off on paper, but we're going to probably going to convert these into a digital map that we can modify a little bit later. We have these two. Do you want to unclamp? So we have these two that are going to be larger continents, but underneath here, you can kind of see we have other places that we're going to make a little bit smaller and put them in the map as we see fit and space things out a little bit differently or resize things so that as we go, we can have a bit of a more cohesive vision. But for now, we've got the basic shapes out and we're going to start putting stuff onto them.
Yeah, because like you can say right out the gate that we want like for natural boundaries, that is going to really make the shape of nations and stuff like that. And so you can already see with just some of the vague shapes of these, that for instance
That's
honestly
an easy
kind of
border.
a natural, exactly, it's an easy border.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, it's really going to depend on other things like rivers, like big rivers or mountain ranges or something like that. And so that's kind of what we're doing now, is making the actual shape inside these map boundaries so that we can have an idea of what fills in that space afterwards.
Exactly. So just so you all understand sort of the approach that we're going at with this. One thing you may notice, we have a bit of a compass going here. This is going to be north, this is going to be south, and what you might notice is that that's a little bit different than a traditional map. Most maps that you see in modern day sort of feel like they go from east to west long ways. We're kind of doing it the opposite way for no other particular reason than that's sort of what we thought. But keep in mind, little differences like this can be fun to play around with the idea of your map making as well.
Yeah, you don't need a north and south pole. You don't need your international date line or your equator or something like that to follow the exact same rules that they do on Earth.
Your Earth doesn't have to rotate in the same way that our Earth rotates. It doesn't have to be the same shape our Earth is. All of these things are completely up to you.
But it does give you a very helpful thing for you as a writer or builder, and as well as people who are reading or playing in your content, to understand a little bit more familiarly if it is at least vaguely similar to how Earth works in real life.
So consider how alien you want your place to feel. If even in another plane of existence or something like that, the Earth acts differently than it does, it can make a place feel more alien. Or if you want to make it feel more familiar, or at least not something that people think about, the more you make it like actual Earth, the easier it'll be for people to transition into these things.
So, in the theme of starting big and macro and zooming in, I think that one of the most impactful things on how this is going to look beyond the outlines is basically our version of the equator, which we had kind of guessed we would put somewhere in this continent here, running sort of down maybe around there, so like that.
Yeah, I think that'll be cool.
We don't have to nail it down specifically right now, but it's a good idea to have that in mind, kind of, so that you know if you have a like temperate equator like we have here, and that's going to be your tropic zone. In real life, not here. But that's going to kind of give you an idea of what your temperature and your geography is going to look like just at a base glance.
So yeah, we can consider sort of this sort of area to be generally, I think, thank you. Neat.
I know I have a big one around here somewhere.
Not my best straight line, but that will work. So this is around where we're going to be putting the...
And is that?
That might be overkill,
Okay.
but thank you. I'll give that one to you so you get that one as well. So that's where we're going to be considering the sort of equator. I think it might be cool if we take some of our medium continents and stretch them down into the south a little bit further. Because if the equator is going to be here, this is going to stretch up quite a bit further. So that's probably a good idea. But
in my opinion, since I didn't have a specific, I kind of find things that aren't starkly frozen to be more something that I'm passionate about writing. So as cool as it is to have, some space occupied by the stark frozen north, I do want things to be more temperate, at least, more comfortably inhabited. And that's always easier in warm or hot environments.
interesting. Well, we have a few different smaller medium continents that we could stretch into the north and south. But yeah, definitely focusing on these as they're going to be our primary land masses. I think a good place to start is to probably lay down a location of the 3 beasts that we've come up with so far.
So, if we want this to be a major continent that a lot of the lens of our setting is going to focus on, that's probably where we'll want to have the big old mountain range dragon. Yeah,
yeah, I think so too. I think
we had considered splitting it between some powerhouse players in like at the nation's power level.
How big do we want? Because the countries can vary quite a bit
For
in
sure.
size, and the thing we're going to have to consider in this instance is how big the countries are is going to reflect in how big the dragon is. Because if the dragon is an effective border, it's got to be close to the size of the country that we're going with. My immediate vision, just like look. Like you said, like here's an excellent place for an easy peasy border.
Natural border, yeah.
And something I had kind of considered was sort of like a area, a split of country, right around this sort of area as well, and the rivalry being in between this and this place. That would make it huge, though. Is the immediate red flag that popped up. So.
Well,
do we want to shrink? Exactly. So we should probably shrink that. Like I said, that was my immediate shot. But yeah, I think shrinking it down is probably a better idea.
Well, I would love for there to be more players on the table in this continent, being kind of at least one of the more central
Exactly.
ones. And one thing in my head that this map screamed to me was that this region around that bay there would be a good place for a very wealthy like trade empire, and like in this zone specifically, like controlling this
it does have an inlet here.
Exactly.
It does have a very, very good inlet here,
and I would like there to be maybe in like this zone or this zone or something like that, a big ol' like river delta. For anybody who doesn't know, river delta is just basically an area where a lot of rivers, or one big river, starts spilling out into the ocean and leaving sediment and stuff like that. That kind of takes.
I think this little blip right here is probably an excellent place for that.
So if we were to say, because that's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a defined area yet for this country or nation or whatever, but I definitely pictured it being centered around this, like, you know, that would be like the population hub is right around the water. But let's say, what if we had a mountain range cut more down the center and take one direction or something like that, and then, or even directly down the center is the main mountain range with like some kind of secondary, tertiary mountains that close it off a little bit more. And then you can have, like, let's say that you run mountains like that. The area where the dragon is, where the mountains are the thickest and the densest, could be like that zone. And there can be, you know, a nation that is somewhere like this, and then something like that, and then that's right in the middle of multiple potential powerhouses as well. I don't know if this is coming through on the camera, these tiny thin little lines, but
if they can't, this is, as much as it would be nice for us to be able to display that easily to you, that's a good technique. Don't your pencil, because it's just gonna start looking bad if you have to erase things that are very, very permanent. So apologies if these lines are a little hard to see, but it'll come out in the wash, and you'll be able to see. I actually had a thought.
okay.
That original sort of border that I kind of created, we could treat that more like how Europe and Asia as continents are. There could be some sort of cultural split here, and then there are countries within that sort of area, because this area feels like it could be easily distinct from this and this area, and then there could be sort of a bit of a triad of
different cultures.
Yeah, like sort of similar cultures, whereas it's like, oh, well, Europe, but Europe's a big place with very diverse and different amounts of people. And so, yeah, you could have a sort of thing like that, in which case we could make the mountain range this sort of area, because then that would split them up. And even, actually, that does raise the question, though. Another thing to keep in mind, when it comes down to where rivers start, typically the whole cycle is, as I'm sure you've probably learned, water evaporates from the ocean, moves inland, dumps on the land, and then it flows slowly from the land back into the ocean. The thing to keep in mind is that where the water is going to accumulate or start to flow downwards is on mountains. And so if often you have a mountain range, you will likely see many rivers coming from the mountain range. So my initial thought was kind of to put one here, but if we're going to put a delta here,
Exactly.
putting the mountains there doesn't make sense.
Mountains can
either.
be nearby, but that's exactly what I was thinking. I don't want the mountain running right to that river delta.
Exactly. So let's go with...
But it doesn't necessarily have to bisect the entire continent, because this is a lot of space. So people are still likely to want a shortcut through the mountains rather than traveling 1,100 kilometers around it. It doesn't have to necessarily bisect the entire thing. It can still run a portion of the way up, and that's a large obstacle that you would want to get around.
Yeah, and yeah, like even if it only stretched like less than halfway, like an obvious border was created here just from the fact that water creeped in a little bit. So like, yeah, having sort of maybe one coming from the top, one coming from there. I like the idea of this area being secluded for whatever reason, whether it's difficult to cross this border or it just starts getting really shitty at the beginning, and you're like, all right, I'm turning around.
It's a low area that is seemingly being encroached on by the sea. Lots of rivers and muck and grime, and so it just kind of is unpleasant to be there. And that obviously is gonna, like, you know, there's gonna be areas in there that are less hospitable than others. But if, you know, we have some other nation that just kind of ends right there and then it's a little unpleasant, then why would anybody want to go past that? Like, people are going to occupy space, regardless of how unpleasant it may seem for others, but much less. So where screams dragon? Where do you want to cut things off? Because I do picture this being like a population hub, this region.
Well, it does kind of scream that. For another bit of context, the reason we single this area out because of the inlet is because when it comes down to trading things, it's going to be easier for a ship to sail out from, say, this location. Say we're trading with even someone up here or in the northern section of here. It's going to be easier for a ship to sail from here out and to whatever location rather than traveling across the land to get to that location. And so, say the landmass stopped here-ish, there wouldn't be as... If you had the city here, sure, you could still send a ship out like that, but having this creates almost a sort of web of the ability to just quickly send goods from one area to the other, which, when that happens, you'll just tend to see higher amounts of people wanting to be in that area and being born in that area due to abundant resources as well.
And
so
it's also very much a natural shelter from harsh weather and storms and stuff like that as well. So it makes for great places for lots of boats to be, because it's relatively safe in here, where big old waves or tidal waves or storms or whatever are not going to be able to interfere with them as easily as, say, over here, where you're out in the ocean, or over here, where again you're out in the middle of the ocean and everything is going to hit you. This is very much protected by not only the sides of both continents, but other islands, and this region itself is going to just sort of filter out a lot of the danger.
Taking a look, I could see easily there being a bit of a rivalry between this sort of northern area and whatever sort of this interesting inlet area is. And so we could put our sort of bisecting range there. Another thing I had considered is this is going to be an area, but maybe this area could sort of rival that area. I like this one though. I think I like this one the most, and so having the mountain range maybe stem in this sort of area, and maybe it could kind of even split a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have like sort of a double range that kind of meets here. Is an idea that kind of popped into my head as well.
Honestly, toss it down somewhere that screams Dragon Mountains, and we'll build around that.
Let's see.
Because that's the only place that I think doesn't need a mountain range.
Yes. I kind of like the idea of it going in a sort of upper diagonal in this sort of way. So let's go with that. It will be more aesthetically pleasing in time. But okay, so we want to probably put the dragon somewhere in this sort of area, like in this sort of mountain range. So we have an idea there. Moving on.
One of the other big linchpins in this was that sort of bay where we had the idea that for lack of a better term, I guess, like the monks that were sort of the dragon speakers. Where do you think seems like a good place for that?
Well, the idea was that they were going to be slightly separated. Like the bay was going to be a very, very populated, very important area, whereas these were going to be separated in a way that they were still around and relevant, like just at least like you could see where they lived, like that's where the monks are, but they were going to be in close proximity to a very powerful place. The easiest very, very powerful place we're talking about is there.
For sure. I don't mind that at all. I am worried about density in that case, because we do have at least 5 more continents. Do we want to toss them on that? Especially because this is one that is going to span the globe, unlike some of the more stationary ones. It
could be interesting if there were kind of 2 seafaring nations that were rivaling each other. So we could move on up to perhaps this continent. There's a few areas where you could possibly sort of shove a bay like that and sort of get away with it. Is there anywhere on this sort of coast that calls out to you that way?
I don't mind the idea of somewhere like over here.
Okay.
Like having that the bay that sort of had those tall, imposing structures, mesas, or whatever, sort of occupying like this space almost out into the ocean. And at this point, that is not necessarily, depending on scale, super far north. But it is going to probably put it vaguely, at least, in a little bit more unforgiving and harsh climate, which I think is cool and interesting, being that the bay itself is a little bit unforgiving and stormy and windy and unpleasant.
Well, and stormy and windy is actually the kind of biome we kind of want to put these dragons in the first place.
Exactly.
What sort of screamed out to me, at least in either here, or here, is the opportunity to use this sort of landmass to possibly extend and start to put out those mesas at the end of one of these sorts of areas. I think this bay or this bay probably gives me more of that vibe. This one's okay, but it kind of dips in very briefly, whereas this has got a little bit more of a consistent...
What I'm thinking is, I like the idea of it sort of jutting into the ocean in a place that is not strictly, like, frequented, because all 3 of those, actually even including that one, do to me kind of say that would be a good place for civilization to build around and use as a shelter, whereas this one is not quite as good, And so it would be
Interesting.
kind of close to this place, like maybe there's a big old city right over here or something like that. And so this is adjacent, but not occupying the space where, like, let's say if we had them in here or something like that, there's gonna be boats going in and out. They're gonna have to be at least a little bit more familiar with these strange and interesting people that we want to be at least a little bit disconnected.
So
Whereas
you want to
having-
put the maces here?
That's kind of what I was picturing.
Okay,
being that,
okay,
like,
okay.
you know, if it's close by to a strong nation, then that nation can kind of occupy this area, wherever that may be. And then this is adjacent enough where they're like, oh yeah, those guys are like over there, like they're nearby, a couple of weirdos though, or whatever.
Yeah.
So they're out of sight, but very close, but not occupying the prime real estate that a global superpower would want necessarily. You know what I mean?
That's kind of a cool idea. Like I like that geographically, yeah. And one thing that just kind of sprung into my mind, purely again, just based on looking at the map and brainstorming about the lines. It's amazing what squiggly lines can do to the noggin. There's sort of an opportunity where there are 3 separate inlets, whereas this one's kind of a big, obvious one. What if there were like individual and sort of rival city-states within each of these?
I've been thinking about city-states the entire time. I love me some city-states. That is dramatic and interesting because you have all of these small, densely compacted people that have sometimes similarities and therefore alliances, but then often also stark contrast to something that could be literally a stone's throw right over there, and that creates a lot of tension and excitement in a small area.
What city-states also do, at least for me when I'm trying to consider world building, is like you really don't see city-states as much in the modern day.
No, totally. Yeah.
And what it does to me is almost screams fantasy to me,
sure.
whether it be medieval or otherwise. But one thing you see, like often when you're thinking of ancient Greece, you think, oh yeah, it was Greece. No, it wasn't.
No, it was not.
It was a cluster of city-states.
Yeah.
And so when you think of...
Greece is a great one to look at. Or maybe we toss up a quick little map of like the Holy Roman Empire. That thing is chalked into like, what do we got? 60 little small areas there that all, they were, you know, the Holy Roman Empire is a little bit different because it is an empire. But each one of those, you know, gives kind of the same image as like if those were all diametrically opposed, or at least not friendly nations, how close you've got all of those things situated to each other, and that they all have different people in charge of it and different motivations and goals and stuff like that. I love that. I love that stuff.
And so it makes the world feel a lot more real to me, because there's just instances where a country is very powerful, but a singular city, its position, its economic prowess, and other factors can just make it where people are just like, we're not part of your country. Yeah. We're technically surrounded by your territory, but we got so much more going for us that where like the people within that city-state have like a sense of like community and loyalty to the city-state. So it's like, we're not Roman. Like, you've completely surrounded us, sure, territorially, but we have so much more going for us, and you need us in a way. And that happens often with coastal cities.
And I think that it's also really interesting too when you have that many like city-states together. Let's say if we chalk them all up in that area, that they may have, you know, disagreements and bickering and sometimes outright conflicts. But also if somewhere that is a big global superpower naval menace, like for instance here, was going to go pick on them, they all have at least vested interest in each other's success because they don't want that guy taking over the entire place. And so when threatened, they can all band together and be a genuinely powerful force. But then when they don't have that pressure, it's right back to the sort of fractured squabbling.
They're the siblings of...
yeah, exactly.
They're like, oh, you can't pick on my brother like that. That's what I do.
Yeah, that's my job.
Yeah.
So
let's kind of put down the idea of maybe sort of like a like triplet cities in a sort of way. That I think is probably going to be something cool that we can touch on and world build on later, but I like the idea of that with the triple inlets. Now, we want to put back to the original topic.
Let's make it canon. Let's make it real. Let's say that in here is going to be sort of those big ol' mesas.
Have you considered Mesa?
So let's say that this is now going to be the... What do we want to call those guys? Or what's a temporary name for them at all?
I mean...
Dragon...
Wind Dragon Mesa?
Or whatever. Let's just go ahead and put Dragon People.
But these are also Dragon People.
Dragon Person.
Dragon Mountains.
Alright.
These aren't the canon names.
This is not canon, yeah.
But okay, so that's probably a cool place to put that. Now, the easiest one of all. Where are we going to put the water turtle?
Ooh,
it's probably going to be in the water?
The water turtle moves around.
Yeah.
So, I love the idea that it's big, right? And like, if we were to have it be, let's say, big enough where it can make its way through this, I mean, I don't even know what you call it, but the continental divide, right? Because this is going to be a big area of space, and you can, like, because if this is an entire, like, nation there, then you have a turtle that is the size of a nation. Or do you want it to be bigger than that, where it can't fit in there? It is borderline continent size, like we mentioned at the very beginning, and so it would drift entirely around those.
Well, we don't really have an exact sense of scale on this map yet.
This is very true.
So I do think the turtle should be able to fit through here.
Cool.
Now, I don't think it goes through here, because what I think would, I like to think that it's just not comfortable. Like, even if it does have, plenty of room to swish and swash around, it's a vast ocean creature, and so the idea of fitting itself in between two land masses, even if it's only this big, I just like to think it doesn't go there. Yeah, it's just kind of a risk. You don't want to be that one boat that got caught in the canal that destroyed everyone's Amazon orders.
But yeah, it's claustrophobic. It's probably against all survival instincts, being that you're kind of putting yourself into a natural trap, right? And then also, if it is truly big, it is, which is probably not necessarily an issue for it, but taking out hundreds, if not thousands, of trade vessels, because this is probably going to be a very central, like, trading hub. And kind of also then people aren't going to be your biggest fan. It's making things messy, so you wouldn't do that to yourself.
It could, well, because I'm thinking, like, one thing is that cities are going to love when it shows up. Is this set of people going to be excluded from that? Does it just, kind of sneaky snake its way in here, kind of, and then make its way back out?
I don't necessarily think that it is going to, make pit stops at cities necessarily. I don't know, it's tough, because I think that, like, it does bring benefit to basically the ocean as a whole, which is going to benefit your fishing and stuff like that. So even if it only skirted past, that would still help these guys out.
Well, so something I was kind of thinking in that realm is this place is prosperous for its own obvious reasons. But what if there were areas that sort of started out initially because it was a primary stopping spot? Like, say, for example, it never comes in here because it just don't want to. But on this other side here, just let's say this area, for whatever reason, the turtle often finds itself kind of resting in this sort of like little nook here, and then it does that over and over in like a 16-year cycle for hundreds of years. Maybe settlements start to crop up in these sorts of areas merely because of that phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it would be an interesting dynamic if this city has everything going for it but that. You know what I mean? And so, like, these are like this is probably all about kind of the same country, but cities over here are like still have some benefits for actually being over there that are excluded from being part of the main capital.
That does exactly kind of like make a good reason why, if this place is so wealthy and powerful, why this whole thing isn't this country, is because they do have something that gives them their own sense of, power and uniqueness and stuff like that. So I definitely do like the idea that people can start building settlements based off of the expectation that it is going to return, as it has for every 16 years or whatever. Do we want to scale it out yet or not worry about it?
I mean, I want to start just throwing more stuff in because we've
Okay.
got
Let's
our
make some more
main
mounds.
3.
Let's make a couple more mounds while
Well,
we're
we
at it.
were considering a desert.
Definitely.
Remember, we were
You're right about
considering a
that.
desert.
Yeah.
So that's another very, very important landmark that I
Okay.
think we're gonna have to put in
I
here
got it.
somewhere.
So two areas, right, that scream to me.
Mm-hmm.
Up here,
Okay.
right near the, or not far off of this place here. You know, river deltas obviously make it very green, but maybe it's not actually very, very plains heavy. It's just because it's got so much floodplains and stuff like that where they're able to do a lot of farming. Think the Nile. It's in a full-on desert, and yet they're still able to have incredibly fertile farmland because of this huge river. Like, let's say that maybe, you know, like, this is all exempt or whatever, but like a desert, you know, is like, I'll do a little bit more firm than that so we can kind of see something like, you know, that or whatever. Like that area is deserty, but then there's like so many rivers coming in from all this way that it just makes sort of this whole area, despite being very deserty, very, very green as well. Or even honestly expand that maybe to include, you know, something like that, right? Where you have a desert that takes up a big old chunk of this, but then because of the fertility that comes along with being a ginormous river delta, this place is not necessarily strictly bothered by that, and probably also extends out into different biomes as well. There are plenty of, looking back, I mean, modern and historic examples of very, very wealthy, very, very healthy and growing and powerful places that do crop up in deserts. It doesn't necessarily have to be a completely limiting factor as long as you've got somewhere to make food and fresh water and stuff like that.
It is an interesting idea. I would also consider the fact that, again, we wanted this sort of country area to be secluded. We could also stick the desert right at the edge here. And so it's actually, instead of a mountain range to cross in order to get in, it's a long distance of fucking bullshit.
I see. Yeah, for sure.
And so not only is this place not desirable to go to, except for maybe for the people who live there, but also like a mountain range is one thing, but you can make tunnels. There can be pathways.
Fill
but
your
it is
water bottle up with some snow.
Yeah.
And breathe on it, and you're good.
Yeah.
In a desert, it's a little bit harder to traverse. Yeah, without you know, vehicles and things like that.
And so it might be. I think it might be interesting to use that as a device to actually block off this area.
Question for you.
Okay.
Do we have trains?
Trains?
Yeah.
I'm
big on trains. I love trains.
Trains
really shake things up, though.
If we do, I feel like it should be like very few, and probably not for like an incredibly long distance.
I want trains. Let's make trains real. They can definitely be like, again, at the very, very pinnacle of science, and so like, you know, maybe you've got a train from like this really, really wealthy and established area to, you know, here, and that's like the only train, or like between all these city states.
I was gonna say
like
the triplet cities. I thought could have been a really cool idea. Actually, that could be an interesting idea for the triplet cities as well. Is the idea of you'll find sometimes in fantasy worlds there will be fantasy, and then there is one civilization that is technologically advanced to the T. Even if they're not very powerful for whatever reason, they have just focused in on that. And I think that could be an interesting idea to have in each of these places. And maybe they've sort of discovered their own unique type of magic that enhances their technology to a certain degree, so it could make them each uniquely distinct from each other, but also have a rivalry in the way that they're trying to constantly one-up each other. It's just an idea as in the world building idea of having, again, a set of triplet cities that are independent yet sort of interact with each other. But you're right, also when it comes down to an area like this, you would likely maybe have a train route up to the mountains, and then maybe one over to like this city we were talking about, where you get all the trade here except for the turtle. So we want to have the means to send stuff to the turtle and the turtle stuff to us. So that's probably not a bad idea either, but
Cool.
maybe limiting it to
So
like
trains,
those
but
two.
minimal trains.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Small wee trains.
Yeah.
It's just a couple of guys on like one of those. What are they? They're just bringing the gold back and forth.
Yeah. Okay.
But so what do you think about putting the desert in maybe this area instead?
Okay. I'll be honest. I really love the visual now of having this wealthy nation be at least in certain areas. I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be that one. I can still absolutely see another nation, small or not. Or we can have more
Having
deserts.
basically the backdrop of a desert behind
Yeah,
it.
but I really like the idea of having a wealthy, flourishing desert nation or country.
One thing we haven't done a lot with this area, and
For
we
sure.
got lots of space.
Yeah, you're entirely right about that. And this is not like here is not really far north. Regardless of the scale, that is fairly close to the equator. So
Yeah,
you're absolutely
absolutely.
right.
Like there could be a large amount of like we've just
Okay.
it's got this big fat
Totally,
plump area where
totally.
we could put anything like that. Now, what slice do we want to put this sort of specific civilization in?
Well, I was kind of thinking maybe in this zone is
Okay,
maybe
okay.
where they would be popping off. How big of a desert do we want?
Big deserts are always cool.
Big deserts are dope.
Like in The Last Airbender, there is the One Shitong Desert, I think, was the one that they ventured into that no one's ever crossed. And just the idea of that is just such a cool thing because it adds, like, in that show specifically, like, there's legends about the desert that make it very mysterious. And even though it's a barren fucking wasteland, you're kind of intrigued. Like, it almost calls to you to just go try and find anything possible in it. You're pointing out this sort of area I kind of like the idea of, because with this little outcropping right here, that could be like, if you put the city in this sort of area, almost like a Solitude in Skyrim sort of way, and then what's left behind it is the remains of a desert, and they've just kind of managed to turn this area surrounded by water into something usable. That could be an interesting idea.
So,
Okay.
desert. How much of this continent are we willing to sacrifice for a big, spooky, impending desert?
I think big could
For sure, that's
Still-
what I was kind of picturing. as
could
well.
still easily be this.
That's still a big desert for sure.
Yeah, it could still easily be that. We could also there's also possibly out to there, or even out to there. The scale is important, but
Well, see, even in real life Earth, there are deserts in cold places. Take a glance at like Mongolia. There's a bit of desert there. Was that the Gobi? And it's a pretty cold place. So it doesn't necessarily have to be defined by how far south on this continent it is. It can drift up into areas that are going to be a little bit more cold.
I think I kind of like even out to this little outcropping here.
Yeah.
This sort of scale kind of feels like a kind of happy medium.
Sure, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's make a desert. Make it so. Teamwork.
Let's make it dream work.
Okay. Now, we won't necessarily have to come up with a name for it yet because that can tie into other things that we are building around it. But let's pop down desert.
That's dessert.
Sure is. Going in for seconds.
That's how big the desert is. It's got multiple S's.
Okay. And then on here, give or take somewhere around that, I'm just gonna say, and we'll leave it at that for now. Just a placeholder. So,
Let's see.
what is there anything containing this desert? Does it slowly spill out into less deserty places beyond it? Or is it gonna have something like a gorge or a...
Gorges are cool.
Gorges are cool.
Gorges are cool.
Or like, does it just turn in kind of slowly into like a Badlands that slowly gets a little bit more and more hospitable? Or is there a mountain range that kind of breaks up the desert and allows finally for some precipitation. I got there.
I kind of like the idea. Just thinking about it and trying to put myself in the world. I'm walking across this desert and I'm almost at the other side. And what do I see on the other side? Jungle.
Okay.
Again, we've got plenty of kind of space to play around with here.
100%. Yeah.
And maybe what could be interesting is a certain amount of like the central area and maybe even some coastal areas of this place being frontier.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean? So mayhaps a certain amount of this place can be like a large portion of just straight up untamed land.
Mm-hmm.
Where you can find exotic creatures and stuff like that.
And ancient but technologically advanced civilizations.
Could also be super cool. Actually, instead of that sort of area, I'm maybe even like...
I say it dramatically, by the way, because that is a trope that... I think maybe I did mention this already, but that is a trope that is simultaneously, like... great and awful, I guess. I like it, but like
overdone.
It's a little cliche.
Yeah, could have that sort of jungle area.
Yes, in terms of jungle, I do think that cutting it off somewhere, here or something like that makes a lot of sense, because you're going to get a lot of moisture from the ocean, and it's also not getting too I don't want to get too far away from the equatorial line, because that is going to be definitely more hospitable for jungle, and I feel like kind of at a certain point here it's got to cut off and become a little bit more temperate, even if that means temperate rainforest. That's totally okay as well. But down here and stuff could be downright tropical, like full on Amazonian style.
We could since there's going to be a border between sort of desert and jungle, we could also put a mountain range
100%.
Specifically in between this.
100%.
And then it's possible when it comes down to just considering weather patterns that generally, for whatever reason, the precipitation tends to come in this way,
but then
and is blocked off by this
exactly.
mountain range, and so
it spills out this for sure. Yeah,
I kind of like that idea. So we should
put them in.
We can probably put a bit of a mountain range in between. And then maybe the desert and jungle kind of like are accessible in this sort of, like you can probably kind of encounter both here. And then...
in that case, in this area, I am tempted to put the Badlands, where there becomes, it is prone to getting a little bit more moisture than the rest of the desert. But maybe that could come periodically and sporadically and violently sometimes, where you're going to get like flash floods, and you're going to get that sort of like typical you envision a desert and you see like the cracked land where you can tell the water does hit and then it is baked by the sun, and that's kind of what I envision for being at least somewhere in here. So
like in that area is just mud.
Yeah, well, like mud and I forget what those are called. There's I know this might be entirely wrong, but I want to say wadi.
Okay.
But areas that are prone to flash flooding and small gorges and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I kind of like that. That feels like a very interesting
right?
location. And
it's
big
also
gorges are
another
cool, as
reason-
we said.
Yeah, right? So let's call, like, maybe this region something like that. The Badlands.
Get yourself a Badland. Yeah, that's kind of a cool idea. I also another reason I kind of wanted to put the jungle here is also just because of the smattering of islands.
For sure.
And jungle islands are cool.
Jungle Islands, dope.
Especially Boomerang Island.
Yeah.
I just like the idea of like a few of these islands also being like their own sort of jungle mystery.
Totally.
It leaves room for mysterious temples and stuff like that.
We love a temple.
So let's put
write it down. Make it so.
Jungle here, and obviously the islands are sort of included in that, and so that could be particularly cool as well.
We are back, and we are going to focus in on another couple of large-scale set pieces to break up and make distinct areas in this map so that later on we can come back and fill in the gaps.
One thing I sort of had an idea about, we were discussing having the mountain range here, but just looking at the map and thinking about it visually, the idea of having mountains that stretch up and sort of bisect the land here, I think is kind of a cool idea.
I like that.
And having, because we wanted to seclude this place in one way or another, and so having a mountain range that sort of stretches down and sort of forks into something more akin to like that sort of shape. Forking mountain ranges are visually interesting, and there's something I really like to stick into my map. So having a mountain range that kind of stretches along the entirety of the continent, I think is going to be something interesting. Having the dragons still be in this sort of area, I think is going to be important.
Yeah.
But it does create a small area here for us to be able to stick something as well.
Yeah, definitely. And then this also, in my opinion, is a kind of another reason why, because you said you wanted this to be like a marshy, swamp, unpleasant area, and so having a place that is already visually being almost like consumed by the ocean, but then also having the mountain range that at least reaches into it a little bit, is going to give you things like a lot of big, strong rivers that is going to distribute an awful lot of water amongst that entire landmass there as well. So I think that adding that entire mountain range there makes a lot of sense. Also, not necessarily always, but a lot of the times when there's a large mountain range, it will be in sort of the center of a landmass because as plate tectonics, but they push together, right, and then create that where like away from the landmass gets closer and closer to sea level until it hits sea level, and then that's where you get things like this. So this may all be a lot closer, well, at sea level, and then as you get further in closer to that mountain range, it's going to get a little bit further up in altitude.
What are mountains what are landmasses if not mountains to the sea?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So that's going to break up this continent and make it a little bit more visually interesting.
Yeah, and like you said, it also gives us a handful of sections as well, where now we can fill in those gaps with interesting and unique other things that are sort of visually and physically separated from the other regions.
You did say there was some idea of like kind of what you wanted to put in this sort of area.
I personally like the idea of having a place that is secluded enough physically by the mountains, but is otherwise doing well in like so that they don't have to focus nearly as much energy or time or money on things like defense, military might, because if there's only 1, 2 mountain passes total that enter their country or their area, that you don't necessarily have to have so much standing military to defend all of your space, because if they're going to invade, they're only coming from 2 spots. So then they can focus their energy on other things, kind of like the Switzerland effect, where you've got sort of this mountain range that your country is nestled in, and I think that it would be cool to have it be like not necessarily plains-y, but like a decent, like fertile land that is sort of nestled up in the mountains, but not like super high altitude where it's snowy all the time. I want it to be a little bit green.
Yeah, so having like a sort of safer civilization that's like sort of hills in a way in that area is probably going to be cool. So I like that idea as well. Did we still want to have like these sorts of borders here, or are we gonna kind of scratch that for?
I think that those can, we'll garbage can the idea, recycle can the idea of making that a desert for now, because I think that I got my desert fix up here. Although I don't think that those are unreasonable sort of vague lines for things like really, really big rivers. Because if we want this to be sort of like a river delta in like this area here kind of situation, that if we have a handful of rivers that connect to one main stream and then come down here and it creates a big old river delta, that's kind of going to follow that general line anyway. And we can also separate this with the help of a big old powerful river as well. Do you want, because this is going to be a distinct own separate area from it, just a little bit further in, how do you want to separate that visually or physically if you do? Or do you want it just to be more of like a cultural separation?
I think a bit of a cultural separation is a good idea.
One thing also that we haven't really touched on very much is we haven't forested up our map very much. And forest is going to, I think, come in a little bit later because that's a very, for the most part, minute factor when it comes to things like separating. They're not necessarily huge landmarks.
Trees are fucking everywhere.
Trees are fucking, exactly. But that is something that can be the case. Like, let's say that, you know, this entire region, or like this whole thing is forested and there's a big old thick forest there or something like that. But that is enough to make it a little bit separate, but not necessarily like a physical barrier.
Yeah, it could be an interesting idea because like this sort of line right here is just
very
an easy
appealing line.
It's an easy place to cut. So yeah, we can consider that maybe. Well, if there is a lot of rivers coming through here, like having this be like a very forested region totally makes sense. And then maybe things start to change as you start to figure out here.
I'll be honest, I do kind of like the idea of this zone being like this whole like bay being sort of occupied by the one guy. So maybe that the barriers would be more like, you know, it kind of takes up that space rather. Do we want to add anything landmarky and large to that?
We have a delta here. We need to know that, and we'll mark that. And then the city is probably going to be this area for the most part. Like the primary city. Like you're probably going to have clusters of towns and other smaller cities around this area just because of the nature of that. And I think we were going to put one sort of here as well. Other than foresty though, I think it's probably okay if we leave that alone until we dive into the area a little bit further.
Huge physical marks there.
Yeah, I think that's.
So why don't we take another glance up here? What do we want to shake up this space here?
Well, so one thing I was sort of mentioning is that I kind of like the idea of a certain amount of this continent being sort of frontier.
Right, yeah.
And so this is jungle, but what we do with up here, I think it would be cool to find something else that's just untamed, unsafe, and something that people are actively trying to push against.
Sure.
So
what's preventing people from having already gotten there and settled it?
It's a good question. I don't really know in that respect, but coming back to the desert here, I did have kind of an idea that was a little bit more of a historical / cultural thing, possibly to do with this, because you were thinking of having like an Egypt-y kind of nation where it was desert, but very, very prosperous.
A thriving country, starkly backdropped by a harsh and unforgiving desert.
So we know we wanted to put the desert snake. That's a thing. That was one of the beasts we wanted to put down, and this is the obvious location that we should put that. I had kind of an idea, and it was sort of spurred on a little bit by. Did you ever see Sinbad?
Not a long time, but I know of Sinbad.
Do you know when they enter like the main villain's sort of dark dimension? It's like a desert, and the sand keeps kind of like shifting in a way, and stuff keeps coming out of the sand and then kind of falling back into it, and like there's like statues and like pieces of buildings and stuff. The sort of visual of that's just burned into my brain as a core memory because I watched that movie a whole bunch.
I'll see if I can find a clip of that.
That would be super cool. Is what if this nation used to be so much bigger? What if it encompassed a decent amount of this desert, and they were so much more prosperous, but perhaps the snake itself or other factors beat it back down into this sort of singular area, which is still incredible, but it would be interesting to kind of make your way out into the desert and be able to find these sort of ancient ruins of types, and it would give you this sort of mystery to an old civilization that could be there.
I think, in my mind, I want them to be separate, but I do like that idea. But what if, in kind of the way that we were talking about city-states over here, that there were multiple, throughout time, cities, civilizations, nations, whatever it may be, that had occupied this this space, that have since fallen for one reason or another, be that the snake or not.
That ancient technology
I like
shit
the
that we're
idea
talking
that
about.
these guys here are like thriving and proud, and not having the history of like, oh man, we've absolutely been decimated, like, you know, that kind of thing. I want them to be up and coming and, yeah, you know, proud of that. But that maybe they're like basically the last remaining like civilization there that is thriving, and maybe they do know about it, maybe they don't know about it, like the previous civilizations or something like that. But I kind of want them to be separated from any previous fallen nations in that regard.
It could be interesting if instead that there was I like the idea of a large nation here. It's bringing up the ancient technology sort of sort of vibe we were talking about, but it does add like this level of intrigue to going and trying to excavate the desert in sort of way.
100%, yeah.
And it could be interesting if these guys have a little bit of a cultural influence of what was here, but they're kind of a new and separate nation that may have once been part of that, but since the fall, things are just starting to sprout back up, and they're almost sort of going, like, it's probably like archaeology is probably a huge thing for them. So going back and rediscovering things in the desert could be just a very interesting, like, sort of plot point just for a location. So I had that idea, and I wanted to dive into it because it's sort of similar to, like, again, going back to the Wanchitong Desert, like the buried library is just such a cool thing. The idea of just this, like, it's basically the sands of time wash everything away in a sort of way. And so, yeah, having a sort of like once prosperous great civilization that's fallen, and now its pieces are being picked back up by the descendants of what is now like a really growing global superpower could be cool, I think. And add some intrigue to that area.
And one thing that I had considered as well is I really do like the idea of the triple cities here, but I do want to have a not necessarily as dense but Holy Roman Empire-esque like amount of city-states or something like that, and I think that this is a reasonable area for them to cover, like kind of this expanse in between, or even just like, you know, anything like that. But I want it to be chopped up into a lot of small moving pieces, and that maybe like these triple cities here are like ex-members of that whole messy scene there, but have managed to thrive and excel and sort of differentiate themselves from that, but being next door to it, because I really want that like just pile of city-states. I love that. I find that very interesting. So I'd like to kind of have them in a region. If you
like kind of can block it out a little bit, like that sort of zone there, and then these guys have sort of claimed this territory and become the.
So toss in city states.
It could be. It could just be an interesting, like it could be an interesting idea just to almost have it be like they are city-states and they're always vying for resources and territory, and it's been like that for a very, very long time, and wars spread up in between them. They have their alliances, their betrayals and stuff like that, and so like this is sort of considered to be one area by anyone who doesn't really live there. Like, but the places within it are always vying for power in almost a warlord-esque way, except on a slightly larger scale than a tribe.
And also, surely a nightmare web to unravel of diplomatic marriages.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would be interesting if these three sort of just grew to a point where they can acknowledge each other, but the petty warring of the other ones. So these three may have sort of unified in a semi-unified in a bit of a tentative alliance in order to protect themselves from possibly what's going on over here. Because I also picture these two being pretty big contenders on the global scale.
Definitely.
This one's making its way up there, and so you're creating this sort of triangle of intrigue. And obviously, one thing, if these guys are going to get big for the britches and go full colonial, trying to make their way over here, these guys kind of end up being a bastion of the of the water and almost protecting the city-states that they once rivaled with as well.
City-states together strong. But, yeah.
So I find that could be definitely a cool idea. We're missing this chunk.
Yes. What makes the frontier the frontier? What is unforgiving about it? I mean, it can be something like cursed land. You know, we don't know necessarily what it is, but something's messed up about it. It ain't right, and that can be for a multitude of reasons.
I kind of picture that more being over here, though.
Sure. Okay.
Like it is swampland, and that's like what I'm picturing biome-wise. But like, in so many fantasy settings, there's the idea of the Shadowlands.
Yeah.
It's so funny, just tangentially. I've noticed just growing up and finding new fantasy novels to look at and checking out maps that they've made almost every time. There's mountains to the north and then the Shadowlands above. And it's
always the Shadowlands somewhere, yeah.
Well, and it's just funny to me because it's almost always over the mountains to the north. Like, I just have no... It happens so consistently, and it's just so funny because you can tell the person making the maps just like...
gotta have an evil place, right? So chuck it there. What keeps it out from our place? Mountain range.
Yeah.
Right?
You know what's even worse about that to me is that when World of Warcraft did it, it was literally above the Frozen Throne in Northrend.
Weird.
Like above Arthas's kingdom, it was the opening to the Shadowlands. I think it was the Shadowlands. Anyway.
Interesting.
I'll have to see if I'm even right on that one.
So I like the idea of like part of like this is swamp for sure, but it's got like this sort of just connection to darkness and being a bad time. So I think putting that on opposing ends is going to kind of create this weird world sandwich. So I would rule that out just in the fact that that's what I picture making this place a little bit more unique. But
I'm just trying to think of a reason why it hasn't been settled. You know what I mean? Or why it's so unforgiving.
Part of it's probably just haven't freaking got there yet. Or
I mean, like, there's always the option that, like, I think that regardless of whether there's big time civilization or not, that there are going to be people occupying that space.
Here's an idea. Thinking back to the greater theme and how our magic system works. We have our sort of locations that are going to be for our main three. We have one here, but what if there's, for some reason, somewhere in here, just a high magical density, just huge, some sort of relic, MacGuffin, something, is creating magical beasts en masse. And so making
like a full-on like rift or some kind of thing like that.
That's causing an overflow of maybe not these massive huge ones, but it's creating them quickly and they're dangerous. And so whatever's in this sort of area is the reason it's inhospitable is the wildlife in one way or another. And so it creates an interesting little MacGuffin, a little something to chase after. I'm sure there's untold stories of the great power of whatever this thing is. And so it gives people a reason to try diving in.
And even if you don't use it as a MacGuffin, where that's the big important thing, it is a cool thing to have in the background of your world.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because that's the kind of stuff that anybody here, they're all going to be like, you hear about that big ol' fuck off vortex in the middle of the, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, that's the kind of thing that people are going to tell stories about.
Yeah.
And so it can, that's an interesting thing. Even if regardless, you don't actually use it as a large scale plot device.
So I think that's probably, I'll just use that as an indicator for it. And then geographically, I'm not sure if it's important what biomes we shove here. I think it might be cool to have a small level of diversity here and there.
Yeah.
And then as we get further north, like there's going to be little ticklings of snow.
Somewhere exactly. Like, I mean, I think that having, like, you know, snow can be like, you know, anywhere in here kind of thing. Like, even like, you know,
but I meant, more glacier
like
line.
permafrost level. Yeah. You know, have it come from like, you know, tickling the north section of this.
And I think, we will probably end up putting another one of our smaller continents, like probably up in this sort of area here. But yeah, so we might discuss a little bit later as we kind of try and zoom in what sort of geographically is going to be around this area. But we know in this area, this is the most important thing. And so when zooming into this area and trying to figure it out, I think basing what is there based on this is going to be more important than, for example, oh, well, we know the dragon's related to the mountains, so let's put mountains there. It's like, it's almost going to be the same thing. We had to put mountains here, knowing that the mountain dragon was there. So we'll touch on this a little bit later, I think, and then the rest of this sort of area is going to be engaged with sort of whatever political stuff is going on with these guys. And I think that kind of gives us
that is
a
definitely
good
like the important standout landmarks and important areas to know about. And then as we zoom in on these things, then we can kind of thresh out the more specifics. Like, we don't have a single river on here, and that is not because we're not going to have rivers. There will be rivers, there will be lakes, but we don't necessarily need them on the map right now to be able to tell what's going on and where.
It's like a lot of, realistically, you really don't see lakes on maps often. Like, I mean, think of a world map, you see the Great Lakes. There's
not a, well, I mean, if you look at like a paper map, if you look at Google Maps, there's a lot.
Well, but that's also, you can zoom into it and kind of picture it there. But like, you're not going to get a ton of lakes unless you zoom in a tad. They have to be very, very huge. And so if we draw them at this scale while we're blocking it out, they're going to be incredibly significant. Whereas I think, like, as we start to zoom in, rivers and lakes, like we're obviously picturing something sort of here. Like, you can kind of infer in certain areas, like the jungle is probably going to have some sort of Amazon-esque river through it. This place obviously is going to have a high level of water density, and that's going to happen. But what we've done so far is sort of block out a bit. Pretty broad strokes. And so as we start to zoom in, the resolution will increase. So I think that's a pretty good place to leave it off for now.
And next episode, maybe we zoom in,
pick a place, figure out exactly what's going on and maybe how it's related to other places, and begin to go from there. So thanks for tuning in to this episode of Simply World Building, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.